Hi everyone, my name is Pamela McCurdy and I will be discussing Chapters 6 and 7 of Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations. Chapter 6 is called Attributes of Innovations and Their Rate of Adoption. This chapter suggests 5 attributes of innovations by which an innovation can be described. These 5 attributes are relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, trialability, and observability. Individuals' perceptions of these attributes predict an innovation's rate of adoption. The rate of adoption is the relative speed with which an innovation is adopted by members of a social system. In addition to the perceived attributes of an innovation, such other variables affect its rate of adoption, such as the type of innovation decision, the nature of communication channels diffusing the innovation at various stages in the innovation decision process, the nature of the social system, and the extent of change agents' efforts in diffusing the innovation. The first attribute we will discuss is relative advantage. Relative advantage is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as better than the idea it supersedes. The relative advantage of an innovation, as perceived by members of a social system, is positively related to its rate of adoption. The degree of relative advantage is often expressed as economic profitability, as conveying social prestige, or in other ways. The nature of the innovation determines what specific type of relative advantage is important to the adopters. Throughout Rogers' Diffusions of Innovations, there is emphasis on the fact that the diffusion of an innovation is an uncertainty reduction process. As individuals pass through the innovation decision process, they are motivated to seek information in order to decrease uncertainty about the relative advantage of an innovation. Potential adopters want to know the degree to which a new idea is better than an existing practice. So, relative advantage is often an important part of a message content about an innovation. The exchange of such innovation information among peers lies at the heart of the diffusion process. I also want to touch base on preventive innovations, since these reflect what we may experience in the healthcare field. Preventive innovations, defined as new ideas that an individual adopts now in order to lower the probability of some unwanted future event, tend to diffuse more slowly than incremental or non-preventive innovations. Examples of preventive innovations are smoking cessation, the use of seatbelts in automobiles, being screened for breast cancer, getting inoculations against a disease, flossing one's teeth, and adopting contraceptive methods. The relative advantage of preventive innovations is difficult for change agents to demonstrate to their clients because the advantages occur at some future and unknown time and may not happen at all. Thus, the relative advantage of a preventive innovation is highly uncertain. Next, we will discuss the second attribute, which is compatibility. Compatibility is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as consistent with the existing values, past experiences, and needs of potential adopters. The compatibility of an innovation, as perceived by members of a social system, is positively related to its rate of adoption. An innovation can be compatible or incompatible with sociocultural beliefs, previously introduced ideas, or client needs for an innovation. Any incompatibilities with values and beliefs may very well block the adoption of an innovation. Compatibility of an innovation with the preceding idea can either speed up or retard its rate of adoption. Old ideas are the main mental tools that individuals utilize to assess new ideas and give them meaning. Individuals cannot deal with an innovation except on the basis of the familiar. Previous practice provides a standard against which an innovation can be interpreted, thus decreasing its uncertainty. The rate of adoption of a new idea is affected by the old idea that it supersedes. Along the same lines, a negative experience with one innovation can prevent the adoption of future innovations. Finally, one indication of the compatibility of an innovation is the degree to which it meets a felt need by the client. Change agents seek to determine the needs of their clients and then to recommend innovations that fulfill these needs. However, potential adopters may not recognize that they have a need for an innovation until they become aware of the new idea or its consequences. When felt needs are met, a faster rate of adoption usually occurs. The third attribute, complexity, is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as relatively difficult to understand and to use. The complexity of an innovation, as perceived by members of a social system, is negatively related to its rate of adoption. Complexity may not be as important as relative advantage or compatibility for many innovations, but for some new ideas, complexity is a very important barrier to adoption. If an innovation is considered too complex, potential adopters may deter away from the new innovation. The next attribute, trialability, is the degree to which an innovation may be experimented with on a limited basis. New ideas that can be tried on the installment plan are generally more adopted more rapidly than innovations that are not divisible. The personal trying out of an innovation is one way for an individual to give meaning to an innovation and to find out how it works under one's own conditions. The trialability of an innovation, as perceived by members of a social system, is positively related to its rate of adoption. The final attribute, observability, is the degree to which the results of an innovation are visible to others. Some ideas are easily observed and communicated to other people, whereas other innovations are difficult to observe or to describe to others. The observability of an innovation, as perceived by members of a social system, is positively related to its rate of adoption. A basic theme of Chapter 6 is that change agents and diffusion scholars must understand how potential adopters perceive new ideas. Such perceptions count in determining the nature of the diffusion process. Now we will be discussing Chapter 7, Innovativeness and Adopter Categories. Adopter categories are the classification of the members of a social system on the basis of innovativeness, which is the degree to which an individual or other unit of adoption is relatively earlier in adopting new ideas than other members of a system. Because increased innovativeness is a main objective of many change agencies, it became the main dependent variable in diffusion research. Innovativeness is the bottom line behavior in the diffusion process. Chapter 7 suggests a standard method for categorizing adopters and demonstrates the usefulness of this technique with research findings about the characteristics of adopter categories. In the early 1960s, Rogers formulated one method of adopter categorization, based on the S-shaped curve of adoption. The time element of the diffusion process allows us to classify adopter categories and to draw diffusion curves. The adoption of innovation usually forms a normal bell-shaped curve when plotted over time on a frequency basis. If the cumulative number of adopters is plotted, the result is an S-shaped curve. These are just two different ways to display the same data over time. The S-shaped adopter distribution rises slowly at first, when there are only a few adopters in each time period. The curve then accelerates to a maximum until half of the individuals in the system have adopted. Then it increases at a gradually slower rate as fewer and fewer remaining individuals adopt the innovation. This S-shaped curve described as normal. We expect a normal adopter distribution for an innovation because of the cumulatively increasing influences upon an individual to adopt or reject an innovation, resulting from the activation of peer networks about the innovation in a system. The S-shaped curve of diffusion takes off once interpersonal networks become activated in spreading individuals' subjective evaluations of an innovation from peer to peer in a system. The part of the diffusion curve from about 10% adoption to 20% adoption is the heart of the diffusion process. After that point, it is often impossible to stop the further diffusion of a new idea, even if one wished to do so. The S-curve is innovation-specific and system-specific, describing the diffusion of a particularly new idea among the member units of a specific system. The S-shaped curve describes only cases of successful innovation in which an innovation spreads to almost all of the potential adopters in a social system. Adopter distributions tend to follow an S-shaped curve over time and to approach normality. As mentioned before, the criterion for adopter categorization is innovativeness. Figure 7.3 on page 281 displays the adopter categories on the basis of innovativeness following the bell-shaped curve. The 5 adopter categories presented are innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. Each of these adopter categories have dominant attributes, which we will discuss in more detail. Innovators are the most venturesome of all the adopter categories. Being a part of the innovator has several prerequisites. Control of substantial financial resources is helpful in absorbing the possible losses from an unprofitable innovation. The ability to understand and apply complex technical knowledge is also needed. The innovator must be able to cope with a high degree of uncertainty about an innovation at the time he or she adopts. The venturesome innovator plays an important role in the diffusion process, that of launching the new idea into the system by importing the innovation from outside of the system's boundaries. Thus, the innovator plays a gatekeeping role in the flow of new ideas into a system. Early adopters, more than any other adopter category, have the highest degree of opinion leadership in most systems, and their characteristic is summarized by respect. Potential adopters look to early adopters for advice and information about an innovation. The early adopter is considered by many to be the individual to check with before adopting a new idea. Because early adopters are not too far ahead of the average individual in innovativeness, they serve as a role model for many other members of a social system. The early adopter decreases uncertainty about a new idea by adopting it and then conveying a subjective evaluation of the innovation to near peers through interpersonal networks. Early adopters, in a sense, put their stamp of approval on a new idea by adopting it. The early majority adopt new ideas just before the average member of a system. The early majority's unique location between the very early and relatively late to adopt makes them an important link in the diffusion process. They provide interconnectedness in the system's interpersonal networks. The early majority are one of the most numerous adopter categories, making up 1/3 of all members of a system. The early majority adopter is deliberate. The saying, "Be not the first by which the new is tried, nor the last to lay the old aside," particularly fits the thinking of the early majority. The late majority is skeptical and adopts new ideas just after the average member of a system. Adoption may be both economic necessity for the late majority and the result of increasing peer pressures. Innovations are approached with a skeptical and cautious air. The late majority's relatively scarce resources mean that most of the uncertainty about a new idea must be removed before they feel that it is safe to adopt. The laggards are traditional in nature and are the last in a social system to adopt an innovation. The point of reference for the laggard is the past. Decisions are often made in terms of what has been done previously, and these individuals interact primarily with others who have also had relatively traditional values. Resistance to innovations on the part of the laggards may be entirely rational from the laggard's viewpoint, as their resources are limited and they must be certain that a new idea will not fail before they can adopt. Next, we will discuss the different characteristics of adopter categories. Diffusion research in this way can be summarized by a series of generalizations under 3 headings: socioeconomic status, personality values, and communication behavior. In regards to socioeconomic characteristics, the relatively earlier adopters in a social system are no different from later adopters in age, but they have more years of formal education, are more likely to be literate, and have higher social status, a degree of upward social mobility, and larger sized units, such as farms, companies, schools, and so on. These characteristics of adopter categories indicate that earlier adopters have generally higher socioeconomic status than do later adopters. Earlier adopters in the system also differ from later adopters in personality variables. Earlier adopters have greater empathy, less dogmatism, a greater ability to deal with abstractions, greater rationality, greater intelligence, a more favorable attitude towards change, a greater ability to cope with uncertainty and risk, a more favorable attitude towards science, less fatalism and greater self-efficacy, and higher aspirations for formal education, higher status occupations, and so on. Finally, the adopter categories have different communication behavior. Earlier adopters have more social participation, are more highly interconnected in the interpersonal networks of their system, are more cosmopolite, have more contact with change agents, have greater exposure to mass media channels and greater exposure to interpersonal communication channels, engage in more active information-seeking behaviors, and have greater knowledge of innovations and a higher degree of opinion leadership. In most of the generalizations mentioned, an independent variable is positively related to innovativeness. This relationship means that the innovators score higher on these independent variables than do laggards. A few variables, such as dogmatism and fatalism, are negatively related to innovativeness, and opinion leadership is greatest for early adopters, at least in most systems. The distinctive characteristics of the 5 adopter categories mean that these adopter categories can be used for audience segmentation, which is a strategy in which different communication channels and/or messages are used to reach each sub-audience. To conclude our discussion, I have a couple of questions I would like you to answer in response to this blog. The first question is, in regards to preventive innovations in healthcare, such as breast cancer screening or vaccinations against the disease, what strategies can one use as providers in order to affect the rate of adoption of such innovations? The second question I have for you is, what are some strategies in healthcare to appeal to different adopter categories and buy into a preventive innovation? Give an example on how you would appeal to the laggard, those who are the most resistant to change and innovation. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to your discussion question responses.